Iowa Women's Archives. Also from IWA are my colleagues, Associate Curator Anna Holland in the back, and graduate students, Emma Barton-Norris, Avery Porter, and Abby Stoon, all wearing the strong-minded Women Make History t-shirts. Before we get started, I want to thank the co-sponsors of today's event, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, and the Iowa City Public Library. Thanks also to the staff here at the ICPL for setting things up today, to the custodial workers, the technicians, and the librarians. This year, believe it or not, marks the 30th anniversary of the Iowa Women's Archives. And what could be more fitting than to celebrate Women's History Month by turning our focus to the vital and distinctive history of Jewish women in Iowa and the Midwest. In so doing, we acknowledge the Jewish roots of the Iowa Women's Archives, a repository made possible by Louise Rosenfield Noun's gift of $1.5 million back in 1992 that created a permanent endowment for the IWA. And our mission then, as it is today, was to collect and preserve the papers of Iowa women from all walks of life. Over the past year, we've partnered with UI instructor Dr. Kirsten Kumpf-Bailey, whose remarkable initiative will bring to our campus a sapling from the tree that Anne Frank wrote about in her diary. The sapling from the original chestnut tree will be planted at the Pentecrest on April 29th. The event is free and open to the public. You just have to go online to register. Numerous events, courses, and programs in the past years shine a light on a subject that has been neglected and marginalized from narratives and interpretations of Iowa's past for far too long. My colleagues and I in the IWA have had the pleasure of welcoming students from 3 sections of Kirsten's course on Anne Frank and her story to the Iowa Women's Archives. And for many years, we've worked with students from Professor Lisa Heinemann's courses on the Holocaust. In the IWA, students can delve into over 50 collections relating to the lives, families, organizations, businesses, and communities of Jewish women in Iowa. These collections bear witness to the contributions of Iowa's Jewish community in shaping our state and regional economy, culture, and literature, as well as its centrality to social and racial justice movements. When the IWA first opened its doors in 1992, the papers of our co-founder, Louise Rosenfield Noun, became the first collection of a Jewish woman to be preserved in our repository. In ensuing years, under the leadership of IWA founding curator Dr. Karen Mason, a cluster of additional collections broadened our understanding of Jewish Iowa, such as the papers of Ruth Salzman Becker, who fled Nazi Germany as a teenager, which have garnered international attention, and the papers of former Iowa legislator Joan Lipsky. And it was Joan Lipsky's inspiration and dedication that ushered in a new initiative to intensify our efforts to expand collections relating to Jewish life and history in Iowa. In 2013, Lipsky, then in her 90s, made a gift of $50,000 to the IWA to support what would become the Jewish Women in Iowa project. She understood the urgent need to preserve Iowa's rapidly disappearing and understudied Jewish history. Her generous gift made it possible for us to hire Jeannette Gabriel, then a PhD candidate at the UI. And we could not have been more fortunate. Raised in a Jewish family in rural Wisconsin, Jeannette Gabriel brought to this project academic rigor, intellectual curiosity, cultural understanding, and unparalleled energy, qualities that enabled her to develop strong ties with prospective donors. Between 2015 and 2018, she traveled widely to meet families and give talks in places like Sioux City, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and Omaha, bringing in 40 additional collections relating to Jewish Iowa. And these collections support and enrich teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in the departments of history and German here at Iowa. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the donors of collections who have joined us today, in person and online. I thank Joan Lipsky's daughter, Anne Lipsky, Sue Weinberg, Kathy Keller, Judy Brodke, Jim Sherman, Ruth Leibovich, Miriam Cantor, and the daughters of Gusti Coleman. We are grateful to them for their generosity in sharing the documents, stories, photographs, and artifacts that bring this important part of our history to light. Today, Dr. Jeannette Gabriel is director of the Nate and Hannah Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She received her PhD in 2019 in social studies education from the University of Iowa, where she wrote her dissertation on how high school history teachers thought about using images to teach racial history. Dr. Gabriel recently curated an exhibit for the Leonard and Shirley Goldstein Center for Human Rights at UNO titled Shirley Goldstein's Immigrant Rights Legacy, Operation Exodus in Omaha. As director of the Schwab Center, she's taught courses in Judaic studies, cross-listed with women's studies, history, and Black studies. And she also teaches academic classes in Omaha's Jewish community, and she serves on the board of the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society. Her current research examines the role of women activists within Operation Exodus. She also looks at African American and Jewish collaboration and conflict, and she studies the history of Jewish newspapers in the Midwest. Her research on post-World War II Jewish refugee resettlements in small towns throughout the Iowa and the Midwest is the subject of her presentation today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jeannette Gabriel back to the University of Iowa for this triple celebration of Women's History Month, of Dr. Kumpf Bailey's Anne Frank Sapling Project, and of the 30th anniversary of the Louise Rosenfield Noun, Mary Louise Smith, Iowa Women's Archives.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you back at Iowa City. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I also want to thank Janet for that wonderful introduction to the Iowa Women's Archives for all the incredible opportunities and support that they've provided for my work. And also, of course, to all the donors who gave to the Jewish Women in Iowa Project. It was my hope when I was bringing in the collections to the Jewish Women in Iowa Project that these collections would form the basis of new, rigorous research that would highlight contributions that the Jewish community throughout Iowa, throughout the Midwest, and throughout what I will call the hinterlands, which is areas that are not large settlements of Jewish communities, that this would come out of these collections. And today, the work that I'm presenting to you is in many ways a representation of the fulfillment of that goal. That very little is actually known about Jewish communities in the hinterlands. And the project that the Iowa Women's Archives embarked on in sending out a graduate student to collect papers from community members is not something that archives typically do. This was incredibly innovative. And through Joan Lipsky's vision about documenting the history of Jewish women in Iowa, we have done something much more. We have documented not just the history of Jewish women, but the history of different communities throughout Iowa, where their papers and collections were not preserved in archives before many of those smaller Jewish communities collapsed. As a result, we rely heavily on individuals with their family histories to contribute in fragmentary ways to building these small Jewish histories. And why does this matter? It matters because this is an unknown history of how small Jewish communities sustained themselves across different waves of historical time, how they sustained and grew, ebbed and flowed. Certainly, there's a national pattern of small Jewish communities growing in the post-war era, and then Iowa is emblematic of a national pattern of Jews in the hinterlands that then those communities minimize and collapse. So this is part of a national historical narrative. And it's so critically important for people to realize that when they give their individual family papers to archives, that this then contributes to this larger body of knowledge and of literature. So many of the stories that I'm going to be telling tonight are not necessarily from the individual collections of our donors, but the papers that they gave contribute to this broader narrative. So I want to begin by mentioning that refugee resettlement has been discussed from the perspective of the refugees. The literature that exists on Jewish refugee resettlement focuses in on individual experiences of refugees and often considers the contributions that were made by Jewish communities as secondary to that, through the lens of the perspective of the refugees. Now, this has been a very important story to tell. And it has been told to the extent that papers are available. For example, there's Beth Cohen's very important work, Case Closed, that examines refugee resettlement and relies very heavily on papers that are available on the Jewish community in Denver. But here in Iowa, we did not have those papers available to us. So how can we learn about the refugee experience? Well, I decided that rather than focusing on the refugees, though I will be telling you some stories of refugees this afternoon, that there was an important lens that had not been previously examined, and that is the role of the Jewish communities themselves. Because when we look at refugee resettlement from the perspective of Jewish communities, we can see how this fits into a much broader and longer historical narrative about waves of refugees coming into the United States. In particular, the Jewish community's decision in New York to try to settle refugees outside of the New York urban area so as not to create a permanent ghetto and to provide opportunities of Americanization for Jewish immigrants, and also to see how those various waves of immigration impacted the way small Jewish communities understood themselves, and through that lens, examining how they viewed the refugees and contributed to their own ethos of the very strong Jewish ethos of supporting refugees throughout time. So with that introduction, I want to start with the moment of 1918 and 1919, which was so important to the Iowa Jewish community. It was a wave of pogroms in Poland, which resulted in a national crisis for the Jewish community, an international crisis to be sure, but the American Jewish community stepped up and wrote thousands of affidavits and contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars in an attempt to try to bring the Polish Jewish refugees over to the United States. So first I want to show you, this is a letter from Des Moines, and this is right at the beginning of these wave of pogroms. And he is writing a letter to the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC in New York, who helps with refugee resettlement, and conveying his concern about his relatives and that he does not have the financial resources to be able to help them during this moment of crisis, and appealing for support. So this is a really important point, that as much mobilization as Jewish communities put into trying to assist the Polish refugees, it was often considered the task of individual relatives, because that's how affidavits were written, is that you had to have a family connection in order to be able to bring somebody into the United States. So I want to tell you about a few of the cases in Iowa where people were deeply affected by this pogrom. I want to start in Boone, Iowa, which is not a place that we think of as significant Jewish settlement. Definitely an example of the hinterlands. And in Boone, Iowa, Ike Goodside, who owned a shoe store, received word in 1922 that his entire family had been assassinated in the pogroms. His sister, her husband, and their 7 children. The only member of the family of 10 who escaped was an 18-year-old niece, and he was working then very hard to try to bring his niece over to the United States. This is a typical sort of narrative of the news that Polish Jews who had resettled in Iowa were receiving about their families. In Waterloo, There's a gentleman named James Robin. And in 1920, his wife, daughter, son, father, mother-in-law, father-in-law, and brother-in-law's wife were all assassinated in a pogrom. His father was actually killed while praying in a synagogue in the midst of a pogrom. His mother escaped only because she was visiting another nearby town. So after this, he did not hear about this pogrom for 2 years. It took place in 1920, and he didn't receive the news until 1922. These types of narratives were just part of people's sort of general experiences. Robin's sister, who had written an affidavit to bring him over to the United States, May Trugman, lived in Waterloo, and her children attended school there. She had returned to Poland and was murdered in the 1920 pogrom. So the international line seemed very small. The experience of the Jewish community felt very much like an international experience. And the struggle to protect the refugees, to save those who survived the pogroms, and to resettle them in Iowa was an important goal for the Jewish community. And especially when we look at communities like Sioux City, where there was a very large Polish Jewish community. They wrote affidavits to bring over thousands of relatives in the period right after the 1919 pogrom. Now, why do I give this introduction to discuss refugee resettlement during the World War II era? Because that period of resettlement greatly affected how Jewish communities understood refugee resettlement over the next few decades. And what was significant about that refugee resettlement is that it was through family individuals. The affidavits were written by family members. Relatives came over. They stayed with family members until they could get on their own feet. Oftentimes, they lived with them for years. They were integrated into the local Jewish community by their relatives. So this is the dynamic that took place in the post-World War I era. And the people who had come out of those pogroms suffered tremendous trauma. This is important to note, that to see everybody in your village being killed was a greatly traumatic events. So for example, James Robin talked about his 18-year-old nephew who survived as being completely traumatized and unable to function. These are important things to think about in terms of how the next waves of immigrants are understood. So I want to shift now to the beginning of the lead up to World War II. And this is a telegram, actually, from Iowa City in the early days of President Roosevelt. And I want to read it because, you know, the telegrams get a little faded. Sometimes it's hard to read it. Be it resolved by Johnson County Taxpayers League that we earnestly protest against the oppressive acts of the Hitlerites against Jewish citizens of Germany, such measures being the symbols of tyranny rather than civilized rulers. That we urge President Roosevelt to use every power of a friendly nation, see how they dealt with typos under telegrams, to restore and protect the rights of all Jewish people in Germany. It's sent by the president of the Johnson County Taxpayers League. This document is found in the Markowitz-Strauss collection in the IWA papers. So this is how these individual family papers contribute to a larger narrative. We wouldn't think of this as being a particularly significant telegram, except it shows a few very interesting things. It shows that the Jewish community was not just protesting as a Jewish community, but they were also protesting through the various secular organizations that they belonged and participated in and were deeply embedded in throughout their communities. And this type of participation was found on a much broader scale for Jews in the hinterlands, in small towns, where they were able to integrate outside of the Jewish community into broader secular organizations. Now here, I want to give another example of Iowa City. This is a protest from 1933 from Agudas Achim, which is, of course, the local synagogue here in Iowa City. And they are protesting against the increased tolerance in Germany. It's so important to note the considerable concern, public concern, that Jewish communities, even in isolated areas like Iowa, showed for the events that were building in Germany at the time. So I want to focus now on a document that is little known in history, and yet I would argue has particular significance. This is a national campaign called a petition from the Jewish People's Committee of New York. And this petition, which was sent to the President and Congress, urged the passage of House Joint Resolution 637, which provided for the admission of refugees into the United States. Okay? This was a project of a far-left organization, let's say broadly communist. And this is a petition signed by 336 people from Sioux City. Now, that is a huge number of signatories. Let me put it in perspective. 489 signed this petition from Chicago, and 497 from Detroit. What does this tell you about the Jewish community in Sioux City? It was a very active, a very working class, and a very leftist Jewish community at this time. And probably that's not entirely a fair representation. Probably many people signed this petition who weren't necessarily connected to any left organization, because there was a mobilization within the Jewish community to have their voices be heard. So now I want to shift to the next wave of refugee resettlement, which takes place in a significant way in Iowa after Kristallnacht in Austria in 1938. And a small number of visas are opened up to allow for immigration into the United States, a small number. And we see a group of immigrants come over who are highly educated, have international connections, and are highly skilled. In most cases, they're intellectuals. And they have a great impact on their communities. I don't know if any of you recognize this gentleman, but it is a name very well known in Iowa City. This is Dr. Arthur Steinler. Okay, Dr. Arthur Steinler was a Viennese refugee. He was a world-renowned orthopedic surgeon at the University of Iowa. He served with great distinction as the head of the Department of Orthopedics for over 30 years, and he was known as one of the world's greatest orthopedic surgeons. He had an international reputation of high acclaim. He was an exceptional teacher, a prolific writer. The accolades go on about his contributions both to the Jewish community and to the university. The local rabbi at Agudas Hakim sends a letter to the local Iowa City newspaper saying that this is a man of such great importance, not just for the Jewish community, but for Iowa City as a whole. And he deserves buildings to be named after him. In fact, there are buildings named after him, right? So why are we talking about Dr. Arthur Steinler? Not just because he was a Viennese refugee who came to Iowa City, not just because of that, but also because of the impact that he had in a variety of different ways. So this, of course, is the sign in Iowa City for the Steinler Orthopedic Clinic. I want to mention that the University of Iowa also has the University of Iowa Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation has a Jackson Steinler Orthopedic Clerkship. And here he is standing with Ruth Jackson. And the reason this is so significant is because Steinler was well known for promoting women within his field when it was not a popular thing to do. And he very much went out on a limb to do this. Ruth Jackson is now recognized as one of the first women orthopedic surgeons in the United States. And there is actually a Ruth Jackson Society, which is an organization devoted to advancing women in the orthopedics. So this was, he stepped in and supported Ruth Jackson and advanced her career when no one else would. But that's not the end of the progressive contributions that Dr. Steinler made. He also signed affidavits for 20 of his relatives to leave Vienna. Okay, 20 affidavits. And this really made an incredible contribution to getting refugees out of Vienna and also creating a community of Viennese refugees in Iowa City of all of his relatives, who then in some cases spread out across Iowa. So he brought over all of his nieces and nephews. Steinler and his wife did not have children, but there were many, many nieces and nephews, and they were people of some acclaim. His nephew, Frank Matthews, who became a graduate student in fine arts at the University of Iowa, was a member of the Austrian Olympic team in 1935, training and riding Olympic horses. And he actually began to teach horse lessons in Iowa City when he arrived and became quite popular. The other cousins who all arrived also joined the University of Iowa and became students there. And in order to help integrate this whole community of Viennese refugees who were both at high school and at the university, Dr. Steinler would endorse like sledding parties and parties at his house to bring the young Jewish community in to meet his nieces and nephews. So he understood that it wasn't just about bringing people over, but that overt measures had to be taken in order to help integrate these new refugees into the community. Steinler said, "I have requested that all of those for whom I signed affidavits become American citizens. I have 3 more relatives in Germany yet. With no word from them in some months, I have no idea where they are, whether they are free or whether they are in prison. It is terrible to be a refugee with no place to go." So these narratives of the Austrian refugees coming in and then helping pull others out is an important part of the story here in Iowa. Let me give you another example. Dr. Jacob Eisenbach was held in a work concentration camp in Poland for 5 years, where he worked in an ammunition factory in 12-hour shifts. His brothers and his sister and his father were all killed. He received a dentistry degree from von Goethe University in Germany. And when he was able to come over to the United States, to Scattergood, which I will get to in a moment, he then was able to shift over to the University of Iowa in a special program and receive his dentistry degree there again. And this is very interesting to think about how the University of Iowa and the State University of Iowa in Ames both supported programs for Viennese, highly skilled Viennese refugees to be able to again practice whatever their profession was when they had been in Germany. So here I want to talk for a moment about Scattergood. Scattergood was a Quaker project in West Branch, Iowa, and actually it brought 185 refugees into Iowa. And a large number of them were Jewish. Not all, but a large number of them were Jewish. Many of them were political refugees from political parties that opposed the Nazi regime. Social Democrats, socialists, a wide range of intellectuals from different sort of progressive parties were in Scattergood. So the Scattergood Project was to basically set up a series of places around the country, and the one in West Branch was to be the first of many, where refugees could be brought out and resettled and live a good, clean life. The Quaker life, which meant getting up very early in the morning and doing lots of chores and being out in the fresh air, which is why the area that was chosen was Iowa, and there was an existing abandoned sort of Quaker school there. And then to sort of be in touch with nature and be integrated into the society as a whole. Well, this had mixed results with the folks who came, who wanted to spend their time writing manifestos to get back into political power in Germany and letters to their comrades who were dispersed throughout the world and weren't actually that interested in gardening. Nonetheless, it was a way to get people out because of both the problems that the Quakers ran into with the internal difficulties of the refugees not really understanding their role, and also some resistance from the surrounding area to the number of Jewish refugees that were brought in. Scattergood was the only one of what was expected to be many Quaker settlements. And later on in the war, in 43, when Scattergood considered shifting over to housing Japanese, the local community surrounding West Branch really sort of rebelled, and the Quakers backed off. So this was a somewhat controversial project, but it did lead to the resettlement of highly skilled Austrian refugees throughout Iowa City and throughout Iowa. And that contributed to an idea among Jewish communities in Iowa about who World War II refugees were. So the model that they saw in 38 was highly skilled, highly intellectual, motivated individuals who could quickly, either knew English or could quickly pick it up, most of the cases knew English, and were able to integrate into the society. And this is 4 of the women who were in Scattergood, many of them highly acclaimed political leaders in Germany. So it was a real sort of cultural disconnect that took place in the West Branch. But I do want to mention, there was quite a bit of support from Jewish communities, both in Cedar Rapids and in Iowa City. The Jewish refugees at Scattergood would spend Shabbat dinners, and the high holidays with the Jewish communities in the surrounding areas. So there was very much an attempt to support them. Now I want to focus on a moment in the Jewish community, whoops, I've got a little something at the bottom there, that's not often talked about, which is that there was a resistance movement in the Jewish community against entering the war. And there was actually a national pacifist movement against entering the war that we see on college campuses manifesting itself with the American Student Union and thousands and thousands of students taking a pacifist Oxford pledge as late as 38. So the Jewish community, here you see the Slotsky family from Sioux City was a part of that movement. So now I want to shift to the post-war discussion of what Iowa is going to do with displaced persons. And the displaced persons who come to Iowa, this is the term that's used, the DPs, for people who are in the camps in Europe. The momentum that takes place in the country is that there are so many refugees that no longer can affidavits be handled by individual family members, especially because many of the DP refugees had no living family members. So instead, there was an agreement between President Truman and the Jewish community to allow the United Service for New Americans, the organization that was set up to resettle the DP refugees, to issue the affidavits so that refugees could be brought over not through individual ties, but through organizational ties. Now, this really changes the landscape of refugee resettlement, because it means that people don't come with that very tight family connection. And in the cases where refugees did have family connections, often families would choose not to support the refugees because the money was being put up by the national Jewish community, so individual families decided they could opt out. So this creates a very different dynamic for refugee resettlement. I want to mention a couple of things about the hostility in Congress to Jewish refugee resettlement, which is really frames how the DP refugee resettlement experience takes place here in Iowa. The quotas are quite small immediately from 1945 on for bringing over refugees out of Europe. And it is sort of being used as a political bargaining chip with Britain, trying to pressure Britain to open up access to Palestine, rather than a serious move to open up our borders and bring over refugees. Sort of in small numbers as an act of good faith, but really you should open up and allow people to go to Palestine, saying in negotiations to Britain. So Congress does pass a bill, but it is so limited that President Truman keeps pushing to bring in more. So finally, we get a Displaced Persons Act that allows for 205,000 DPs to enter the U.S. between July of 1948 and June of 1950. So that's a very small window. right? It's a very small number. And there's a really important cutoff date that's imposed, that the refugee had to show up at the displaced persons camp by December 22nd of 1945, which many refugees did not. So they were not even allowed to participate in this resettlement to the United States. Now, a further restriction was put in place because there was concern from Congress, particularly from the Senate, and we see this really coming out of the Southern Democrats, that there would be too many Jews. So 30% of the entrance visas were allocated for agricultural workers, thus explaining the headline that you see here, right? DPs learn Iowa farming methods. And they had to continue as farmers in the United States. So it couldn't just be a way to kind of get you over to New York, right? It had to be something that you would commit to continue. And then in addition, 40% of those 205,000 were of Baltic extraction. And the Jews were not the group coming from Baltic extraction. So the refugee resettlement experience largely in Iowa is farmers and people from the Baltic. And that is the public face of refugee resettlement in Iowa, not the Jewish refugees. Here's another example. DP finds success in free land, right? This is not the experience that the Jewish refugees are having. The Jewish refugees are not being brought over and integrated into these sort of farming arrangements. First of all, let me say, this was not, they say success, 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 but it was not a success, actually. The DPs who came over from the Baltics were not interested in being isolated on small farms throughout Iowa where they received very little pay and lived in substandard conditions. And there was a lot of rebellions and just walking away. So that the headlines would always acclaim success, but the reality behind that was significantly different. So the USNA really is, the Jewish community is trying to figure out ways to resettle refugees outside of New York. So that again, this idea of integration and becoming American very quickly. And so they contact small Jewish communities all throughout the United States and say, how many can you take? What is your quota? We'll send you so many families. But there's a couple problems because the DP settlement at the end of World War II is not overwhelmingly families, right? There is some marriage and having children in the displaced persons camps since the people were living there year after year after year, but a large number of the Jewish displaced persons were single men. And this created a problem for small communities across Iowa and perhaps in many other areas of the hinterlands. And the problem is that small Jewish communities throughout Iowa were really heteronormative communities. The way they sustained themselves was in heteronormative structures. And what I mean by that is the focus is on the family, the straight family, right? The children. The community religious education is geared around the boys' the bar mitzvah and the girls' bat mitzvah later on, but around religious education, around integration of families, around these family units in coordination with each other, forming strong social institutions. There is not a role for single people in these communities. And oftentimes you see throughout the history of Jews in Iowa that single individuals who don't fit into this heteronormative structure, leave those small communities fairly quickly or are tremendously isolated within the communities where they live. Not because of any bias or hatred, but just that it doesn't fit into the structure of how the small Jewish communities are structured in small towns. So how are they structured? Well, so first I want to talk, let's see, where am I? Jacob Eisenberg, I will come back to this. He is another, he's a DP, there's a lovely picture of him, a DP who settles in Iowa City. And he is an anomaly, okay? He is highly educated. He comes over and enters the University of Iowa, gets his degree in dentistry, and has a successful career. This makes the Jewish community comfortable because he mirrors in a way what the Austrian refugees look like. Jacob Eisenberg, who actually is still alive and returned to Iowa City in 2017 for a visit, had a tremendous impact in his field, and you can see this is actually issued by the University of Iowa College of Dentistry in 2017. So the model, as long as the refugees fit this model of being highly educated, they could be easily integrated. But those who did not fit that model had a more challenging time. And this is compounded by the fact that many of there was a lot of depression and other significant health issues that communities then had to address. And this was not really understood or expected by the small Jewish communities that were integrating refugees. Carl Weiss, who was a refugee from the DP camps, was resettled in New York, and he couldn't get a job there, so he went to Weiss, and they told him they would send him to Cedar Rapids. All right? So to be a watchmaker. Now, he wasn't able to get a good job in New York City, so he thought he would try to be a watchmaker in Cedar Rapids. And as his wife, Erna, said, we didn't want to go, but there was a job open, so we went. It took Carl 2 years to learn English. They arrive in Cedar Rapids, and he works at Ginsberg Jewelry and Musical Instruments, which is a local business in Cedar Rapids. And his wife, Erna, goes to work at Smolikoff's department store, sewing linings and fur coats. So the local Jewish community takes them under their wing and tries to help them with jobs. What they did not anticipate is that Carl would get TB and be sent to the Oakdale Sanatorium for a period of several years. And this puts the family in crisis and makes it a tremendous burden on the small Cedar Rapids Jewish community to continue to support this family. There was a lot of resentment among people who had these experiences, feeling that the Jewish communities didn't help them enough. And Erna is no exception. She talks about how they went to the temple and asked for help in paying for the state hospital and didn't receive the type of assistance that they expected. We see this tension over and over again between refugees in the post-war era and Jewish communities. Not because the Jewish communities didn't want to help the refugees, but that they didn't know how to respond to the problems as they arose and to have the institutional structures to allocate resources, to monitor the families and the problems and keep up with them across a period of years. In fact, even in New York, the Refugee Resettlement program was, we'll help you get a job and then you're on your own. So it was not about sustaining people across the long term. Of course, in smaller Jewish communities, it wasn't that easy to kick people out of an office, right? These were folks that you were going to see day to day and have ongoing relationships with across time. I did want to mention another point. This is a wonderful little memoir written by Henry Ginsberg from Sioux City. And he's talking about how in the 1930s and the early 40s, how broke the Jewish community was. Because, of course, keep in mind that the Jewish community throughout a lot of small towns in Iowa was small business owners. And they were affected very greatly by the Great Depression. A lot of small business owners went bankrupt. And so it's important to take into consideration that these small Jewish towns are still greatly feeling the impacts and haven't fully recovered from the Depression and the war years in terms of sustaining large amounts of money of support. There's also the question of priorities and whether the priorities should go to funding Jewish settlement in Israel or whether it should go to resettling refugees at home. And that's a discussion that you see throughout Synagogue executive papers in Iowa that are now located in the IWA archives to be able to track those kind of internal dialogues and discussions. And this is one from a board of directors meeting in Sher Zion in Sioux City in 1947, where they're trying to decide about allocating money and where the money will go and how it will best serve the community. And there is no clear sense of one position over another. And the reason that's significant is because when it comes to refugees like Moshe Leibovitz, and this is a picture of him in Sioux City, and then with a reunion of survivors from his community. His family was very impoverished. Moshe and his wife Fanny came to Sioux City to resettle near a family member who was not interested in supporting them. They were members of the very small Orthodox synagogue, and Moshe lost a leg from health problems soon after arriving to the United States. He wound up working as a peddler, going up and down the hills of the streets of Sioux City on his one leg. So it was really a very tragic family experience of struggling to survive. And the family really didn't have the ability, the amount of trauma that had been inflicted on the family was really significant. Fanny died at the age of 46 from refusing to go to a doctor because she was scared of the medical establishment. It really was a challenging experience for many of the refugees coming out of the displaced persons camps who did not have resources or education to survive in small communities in Iowa. So I want to talk for a moment here about Council Bluffs. Council Bluffs at the time had a thriving Jewish community center in the post-war period. The Jewish community in Council Bluffs has almost all but dissipated. There's about 3 Jewish families living still in Council Bluffs. That may be an overestimation of 1. People largely moved to Omaha when they got the chance. But there was a thriving Jewish community in Council Bluffs. And here is a picture of their records of their refugee resettlement project. They were very, very committed to refugee resettlement in Council Bluffs and made a tremendous effort to integrate the refugees that were sent to them. However, it was still a very challenging experience. Now, here are some of the local women from the congregation, and you can see that this is a very tight-knit community. The family ties are very close, and they work together to try to sustain what is a thriving but already quickly diminishing community as people cross the river into Omaha. This is the Gershon Store. And the Gershon Store was in some ways the headquarters of refugee resettlement in Council Bluffs. Miss Ben Gershon's daughter was Shirley Goldstein, and she becomes the leader of Operation Exodus of resettling Soviet Jews in the 1980s and 90s. And she specifically mentions over and over again how important it was for her to see her father's role in the Council Bluffs World War II refugee resettlement, that really motivated her. This is a very important thing that comes out of all the complexities of the post-war refugee resettlement, is how the Jewish communities in Iowa and throughout the country make another attempt at refugee resettlement beginning in the 1970s into the 90s of what we call, I suppose we would call today, Ukrainian Jews, right? So I'd like to try to, how's my time? Okay, I'd like to try to play a couple of moments here. This is a video of a gentleman who comes to Council Bluffs, Leo Silberman, and he's giving this talk in St. Louis, and he's talking about what it's like coming to Council Bluffs. It's very charming. I'm just going to see if I can play this for you.
I remained in Landsberg until President Harry Truman opened up the United States to all displaced persons, including Holocaust survivors. I sailed to New York on June 22nd, 1949. I docked on July the 2nd. Because I had no family in the US, my entry this country was supposed to be a small Jewish community in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Had anybody heard of Council Bluffs? When I came to the United States and New York, no one knew about Council Bluffs. I was met by a Jewish representative with my train ticket for the rest of my journey. I also delivered to customers orders Once I was pulled over for speeding because I wanted to make good time. That's when I learned that you needed an American driver's license.
He's now talking about being in Council
Because
Bluffs.
I was driving with a license which I had from Germany, but it was no good then. Omaha, Nebraska was very close to Council Bluffs. I went to night school there, and I played soccer on weekends. To make extra money, I worked a night shift in a factory. I also kept in touch with Paula, who
That's
had
his
settled
wife.
in Cleveland with her family. In 1951, after moving to Cleveland, we were married.
So he leaves Council Bluffs, but his experiences are in some ways very typical. He arrives, he's embraced and assisted and given a type of low-skilled job because he doesn't have English skills. Pushing a broom is a narrative that's often given. Working in a factory, many of the DP refugees talk about the good experiences that they have, being sort of protected by Jewish businesses who are giving them space in sort of make-work situations. Yonkers and Des Moines took in many of the refugees who didn't have language skills and put them in the back of the store. But for smaller businesses, it was sometimes more challenging. There are narratives out of Cedar Rapids of refugees feeling exploited by Jewish businesses who need people to work long hours, right? And this creates a tension of what the expectations are of refugees coming out of the DP camps between, as compared to what the realities are for Jewish life in small towns in Iowa and throughout the hinterlands, is that in many cases, the Jewish community is working in small businesses, very long hours, without much remuneration. And many of the refugees who have suffered for so long in Europe were looking to rebuild a middle-class experience that they had before the war. So this is a tremendous tension. And when we only look at the refugee experience and we hear those tensions, it makes it sound as though the Jewish communities did a tremendous disservice to the refugees. And yet when we look at it through the lens of the Jewish communities themselves, we can see how they're struggling to allocate time and resources to assist community members. So the refugee resettlement minutes of the Council Bluffs Synagogue make for very interesting reading. Their biggest crisis is housing. This is the early 1950s. There still is not an expansion of significant housing, and it's very challenging to find places for refugees to live. And this was a real tension with a lot of refugees who were disappointed to be given very small apartments, or in the case of Council Bluffs, kind of rundown homes. Because Council Bluffs, of course, was not a significantly wealthy community. So in the housing committee reports from Council Bluffs, they talk about sinks being broken, stoves that are donated don't work. The kind of day-to-day challenges of just housing the refugees takes tremendous effort. So there's also the question of how quickly many of the refugees want to leave the community and want to go back to New York, right? Especially after they feel very isolated. So in 1950, the Sioux City minutes discuss how Rabbi Leifer, Herman Krause, and Lee Bernstein, several members of the congregation, are calling on different refugee families and trying to convince them to stay, whereas the families are packing up and heading to the railroad station, right? So in order to support trying to get them to stay, the Jewish community is paying a stipend to the refugees each week until the families can be self-supporting, which in many cases is much more than was done in the larger cities because of the close ties and the personal relationships. The Council Bluffs Jewish community is paying for hospital bills for the refugees who are facing tremendous problems. And when the different refugees come to them asking for loans, they try to hand that over to the synagogue to share the burden. So there's an attempt to try to find ways for all the institutions within the Jewish community to be able to lend a helping hand. At the same time, the Jewish community is frustrated that they're holding Americanization classes, and many of the refugees who are working long hours cannot attend these Americanization classes learning English, and instead have to try to figure out how to learn English from watching Westerns, going to the movie theater, or just having conversations with people at work. So there's a disconnect between what the community is trying to provide and what the refugees are often able to do. So I want to talk for a moment about the Gawara family who resettle in Council Bluffs. And the picture of the two men is from the DP camp. And then you have the family together in Council Bluffs. The Gawara family stays in Council Bluffs. They're one of the few refugee families that stays and spends the rest of their life then in Omaha. And what's interesting about the Gawara case is it's a very typical case of refugee resettlement. Mr. Gawara was in the hospital for quite a while after initially settling in Council Bluffs. We don't know why, but we can imagine the kind of medical problems that people had coming out of the camps. And the Jewish Federation in Council Bluffs decides to pay the family weekly stipends until Mr. Gawara can get back to work, not expecting that that situation lasts as long as it does, because it winds up lasting for a period of years. Eventually, the Gawara family does get on their feet. It's a very happy picture of them with their young son on the bottom. But this type of story of the refugees staying and having a happy integration into the community is the exception more than the norm. So I want to talk for a moment about Daniel Sontag, who was in Buchenwald, and he arrives in Waterloo. He's brought by the rabbi, the local rabbi. And the local rabbi actually is encouraging, one would even say pressuring from some of the letters and testimony, family members to take in refugees, and from 38 on, writing a tremendous number of affidavits. He's really an activist rabbi, and this is kind of a model that we see, is that in some small communities, the refugee resettlement was being driven by the rabbis themselves. So he is instrumental in bringing in this young man, who resettles in the community and is very actively trying to learn English and integrate himself as an American. But it highlights that experience of the endorsement coming from the rabbis, who are often moving from congregation to congregation, so have sort of more of an outside perspective rather than just being embedded in the ideas of the local community themselves. I want to mention Lily Wendell. Lily Wendell is a really fascinating case. She brings over, she is a refugee herself, an Austrian refugee, and then she brings over her nephew after the war, and this is a letter that she writes in the local newspaper. And it's such an interesting letter to be written by somebody who is a refugee and is endorsing refugee resettlement, advocating for the beauty of the German culture not to be lost in sort of the tumultuous moment of attacking the Germans at the end of World War II. It speaks to the complexity of the experience of refugees, that they don't want to abandon and leave their cultures behind and completely Americanize, right? That they're walking a more diverse road of engagement. This is a story that comes out much later about Sam Goldstein, who was a refugee in Sioux City. And Sioux City is a very interesting example because Sioux City really is unable to look at the refugees through the lens of 1948 through 1952, when the refugees come into the country. They look at the refugees through the lens of 1918 and 1919, which was when they had the experience of the Polish pogroms. And there's a beautiful piece written by Oscar Littlefield, who is the sort of only known historian of the Sioux City Jewish community, where he says the lens that the Jewish community looked at the World War II refugees was one of, look, the Jewish community has always had refugees. You're just part of the latest wave. And yes, you endured trauma, but so did the generations before you. So pull yourself together, get a job, and move on. And in fact, it took a period of about 30 years to actually successfully integrate the World War II refugees into Sioux City because of that perspective. And I absolutely don't say this as a condemnation. It's the perspective, the lens through which the Jewish community was understanding that next wave of immigrants without fully comprehending how different this group of immigrants was as compared to the groups that had come over before. That they had endured at least 12 years of struggle, that whatever path to socialization and professionalization they might have had or any wealth had been completely destroyed, and that the level of trauma, even compared to the pogroms, was significantly different based on just the length of time of indoctrination within the European society against Jewry as a whole. So this is a story of a young woman, Renata Vatrum, who goes to work at the sanatorium and is sort of horrified at being out in the farmlands of Iowa. And this is an interesting perspective to consider, that not all of the DP refugees were immediately resettled by USNA, but often would come in afterwards for jobs. And their experience then with the Jewish community was more marginal, if they had any contact at all, because they weren't necessarily integrated or in places where there were existing Jewish communities. And in those cases, they often have very negative perspectives about what Iowa has to offer them. And I want to talk for a moment then about Gusti Coleman. This is Gusti with a political organization that she belonged to, a social democratic organization in Vienna called the Red Falcons. And she came with her husband before the war, after Kristallnacht, and was able to get a job at Cornell College. And the one thing I want to mention about Gusti, important to consider with refugee resettlement experience in the early 1950s, is the pressures of anti-communism in the United States. So this creates a problem for refugees who may have been part of resistance movements or social democratic organizations, because the Jewish community is being condemned as being linked to the left or linked to communists. So in small towns throughout Iowa, even when there was a history of socialist or leftist activism, like in Sioux City, the Jewish community sharply turns against that in the 1950s in order to be accepted and integrated as patriotic Americans. So people like Gusti, who had a background in a social progressive movement, do not speak about these experiences, in some cases at all throughout the rest of their lives, and in Gusti's case, not until much, much later in her life. So it silenced a lot of experiences that refugees had. And the Jewish community does this out of a sense of necessity in the post-war era, but also a sharp turn to the right, both of those things taking place at the same time. This is a political shift. So what is the legacy of refugee resettlement in a place like Iowa within the Jewish community? I'll skip over a few of these. I want to talk about the Russian-Soviet resettlement that took place beginning in the 1970s, begins in Des Moines, and then a significant number of Russian Jews are also settled in Sioux City. So the Jewish community really steps in a different type of role. They are able to provide a lot more resources and think about long-term sustainability, but they run into some of the same problems that were faced by the earlier wave of refugee resettlement, which is many of the refugees stay to themselves in an insular community and don't make a lot of efforts to integrate into the rest of the society as a whole. But this differentiates largely, again, between the different waves of Russian Jewish immigration. The earlier wave of Russian Jewish immigration is people who are political activists against the Soviet Union, who are called refuseniks, and they come for ideological reasons to live a Jewish life, versus a latter wave after the collapse of the Soviet Union and with Chernobyl, where you see many people coming in order to get out of conditions in the Soviet Union, which is more important for them as refugees than perhaps integrating into the local Jewish community. So there's a diversity of experiences. I want to mention, again, in the interest of time, I'll skip a few. Fred Lorber, and I'll end with Mr. Lorber. He was a Viennese refugee who became very well known in the Des Moines Jewish community, was a leader in the Des Moines Jewish community. His father was typically imprisoned in Dachau right after Kristallnacht, which happened to so many men. And the family was actually able to get visas to get out to New York City. When he arrives in Des Moines, which happens after he's in the military, goes to New York, joins the military, becomes integrated sort of into American culture. And he says, I was no longer a refugee, an immigrant, or a second-class citizen. I had this community here, talking about the Jewish community in Des Moines, gave me the unbelievable opportunities to actually actualize my life. So it's interesting to think about those success stories where the refugees did find that the Jewish communities provided them a great deal of support and sustenance. Now, Lorber was the president of the Jewish Federation in Des Moines in 1973 and 1974, which is when the first wave of Russian Jews come into Des Moines, the refugees. And he went to the airport to greet the two immigrant families on behalf of the Jewish community. And he forms personal, very close ties with these two Russian families and enters into business relationships with them. One of the Russian immigrants has a very important patent that they are able to actualize through Fred Lorber's contacts. And they become very successful business people together and make millions of dollars in business. So this is really sort of a tremendous success story of interweaving generations of refugees working together through the Jewish community. And it was about how to use pipelines and compressors. And Lorber said that each of the three partners initially put in $25,000, and then they got an investment company in Minneapolis to bring in $6 million. So this became quite a successful business. They finally sold the company together for $25 million. So these types of stories of financial success, while a wonderful high point to end on, are not meant to in any way diffuse the complexities of the refugee experience. But I would argue to only look at the refugee stories themselves and not the types of pressures and motivations that were coming out of small Jewish communities, for example, in Iowa and perhaps other areas throughout the hinterland, doesn't give a full picture of how the Jewish community understood the refugee experience in the post-World War II moment. I would argue that we cannot look at one refugee resettlement experience in isolation, but must look at the waves of refugee resettlement to fully comprehend how the Jewish community understood their role to each other and how they lived up to those challenges in carrying out the social obligations, the ethical obligations in helping the next generation of immigrants resettle into their small, tight-knit communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. That was really amazing to listen to you and hear just how much work you've done and how far you've come with your work. And I just have one question that you don't have to answer now, but I do want to bring it up, talk about it later. When is the book coming out? But we have time for questions, and so I'd really like to open it up. Anna will bring the mic to you if you have a question, please. This is an opportunity.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I mean, again, having watched this project since its earlier stages, it's just incredible to see what's coming out of it. I'm thinking about the diversity of not first arrival points, but the diversity of places in Iowa where people came, ended up, and whether before the war, right after the war, a few years later. To what extent, with all of that, is then, in a sense, maybe subsequent departure? Like, how do we think about that, the varieties of those of how people end up, and the size of the refugee community and the level of integration? How do we move from that to the then subsequent decline of so many of these communities? Do they seem to sort of follow a similar pattern, like, well, next generation comes up, they go to the Twin Cities for college, and that's the end of that? Or are there kind of different patterns depending on what happened with that initial experience of integration?
That's a great question, Lisa. Thank you. It's hard to give a single answer, right? There were many sorts of different experiences. I'm thinking about in some cases, if there was children who came over in their teen years, especially boys, they would immediately sign up for the military as soon as they reached the age of 18. And actually, this was an issue I didn't get to in my talk, but for the Austrian or German refugees who came in after 1938, they were not citizens for the most part going into the war period and were labeled enemy aliens after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So that created complications for them being in small towns, having to register as enemy aliens. So many of the refugees found that a frightening experience. The question of what happens with the children is difficult because in some cases the children integrate very easily and go on to college and leave the communities. But that is often based on their class status. So in cases where the children are coming out of families that were more impoverished and did not have educational opportunities to the same extent, they will often stay in the communities and engage in that sort of next generation pattern of working in the factories, certainly in cases like Sioux City where you had good jobs in the meatpacking plants, or opening small businesses of their own. So I would say there's really two separate paths based on class. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was really interested in your essential point, that understanding the experience has to be not from the point of view of the refugee alone, but from the Jewish community that took them in. But it made me think about, can you talk about, I'm sure another aspect of it all was the greater Anglo community that they're entering into, and how the relationship between the existing Jewish community and their bigger community was. And I just wondered if there were any things that you've learned that you'd want to share about that influence on the whole experience as well.
So that's a really fascinating question. For the most part, the refugees stayed very isolated just in communities with other refugees. So there's an interview with a gentleman who settles in Cedar Rapids, and he's asked by the interviewer if he had friends in Cedar Rapids, and he said, well, yes, he certainly did interact with the other refugees. There was a refugee community. And the interviewer asked him, well, did you date? And he's like, there really weren't many women. And you realize in that moment, he's not talking about Cedar Rapids Jewish community or Cedar Rapids as a whole, but only this very small number of refugees. So the refugees, in a sense, certainly in the first few years where they're learning English, are really deeply isolated. In terms of the interconnections between the Jewish communities and the broader communities, it really depends on the community itself. In many cases, Jewish communities throughout Iowa developed ongoing relationships with the communities where they were. And in almost every single interview that I've done with people who grew up in Iowa, they always wanted to stress to me the very positive relationship that the Jewish community had with the outside community. Now, that's not always the case. There's a wonderful film, and we have the filmmakers collection in IWA called Yidel in the Middle, where the filmmaker discusses growing up in Des Moines and the challenges that the Jewish community there faced in sort of trying to situate itself to the outside anti-Semitic pressures, which were not overt, but were certainly there. And one of the most important ways that Jewish communities, I think I alluded to this, but let me try to spell it out a little deeper, is that a lot of the Jewish communities tried to respond to the pressures surrounding them, which were often very unspoken and would only really manifest themselves as when girls, particularly girls, got to dating age, they would find their circle of friends was gone and their opportunity to meet boys very limited, right? So it would manifest itself in sort of very quiet ways, but nonetheless it was there. And so one of the ways that small Jewish communities really tried to address these problems was by really creating very, very insular worlds. In Sioux City, in the 60s onward, the young people would all leave high school at lunchtime and walk over to the Jewish Federation and eat lunch together in the Jewish Federation, would not even be in the high school. And they were very happy in that separate world, but they also understood that they were doing it for a reason, right? That they were really not welcome in the larger social community. And I think this really lends itself to some of the conservatizing pressures or homogenizing pressures that you see in small Jewish communities, which I spoke to about the heteronormalization, that it's really in response to not making waves, not being seen as troublemakers. And when there are moments where there have been trouble for Jewish communities in Iowa, like the Postville situation at the meat processing plant, it's been devastating for the small Jewish communities throughout the state, in the sense that you have national protesters, Jewish protesters showing up in Postville, and local Jewish communities, in many cases, feeling like they're caught up in something much bigger than they know how to deal with. It creates subtleties. You know, I tend to think of this even from my framework of growing up in rural Wisconsin. I didn't know how to understand some of the anti-Semitic pressures that existed. I knew I lived in a racist community, but I wasn't really able to vocalize that it was also an anti-Semitic community because it was so much more subtle, but yet there. Right? So there is integration into community organizations, but there's also a self-modulating behavior. Any questions online, perhaps?
I think that's one very nice comment. Maya Coleman says, so excited to see Jeanette. She was such a special friend to my mother, Gusti Coleman.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you, Maya.
Well, I just want to ask you if you can talk a little more. Can you talk a little more about how your research and developing these relationships with donors sort of propelled this work? And then also, you focused, which I appreciate very much, on Iowa here, but have you looked into other Midwestern states? Have you had an opportunity to do that, or do you intend to do that?
Great questions. Thank you, Janet. So first of all, I will say I would not be able to do this research if I had not had the experience, not just with curating the collections, but experiencing building relationships with the incredibly generous donors. People invited me into their homes, they invited me into their communities, they shared stories with me and meals with me and brought me to services, and it was in a complete embrace. And through that, I really came to understand in many ways what life was like in small Jewish towns in Iowa, in small Jewish communities in Iowa, in ways that I would have never been able to understand if I had only been looking at archival papers. That it really was about the types of stories people share, right, about their day-to-day lives and what those day-to-day lives are like. And those stories are so often shared off the record. I want to particularly mention the generosity of Ruth Lebovich in Sioux City, who invited me into her home and cooked for me and shared stories about fishing catfish in the river, and her crossover with the African-American community in Sioux City and how unusual that was to have crossover between the Jewish and African-American community, but that her family was seen as such outsiders that she was actually able to sort of create those ties. And it was little stories like that that helped me really understand the challenges that were faced in small communities in Iowa, and also to be deeply sympathetic, I think, to things that an outside researcher might be critical about. You know, it's always very easy to go into the archives and read people's papers and say, well, I wouldn't have done that, yes? But when you meet with families and you understand what it's like to be in a very small network where people in the community know absolutely everything, not just about you, but about your parents and often your grandparents, right? There are no secrets in a small Jewish community. I chuckle about this even in Omaha. I live in a city of 1 million people and a Jewish village of 8,000, right? That there is a certain amount of self-regulatory behavior that must go along with that, and that rather than just condemning sort of decisions that maybe I as a researcher wouldn't agree with, it gave me a much greater sensitivity to seeing why those decisions were made. And I will also say that going to the communities made a big difference, right? To be able to see what it was like to live in the Jewish neighborhood in Ottumwa, right? And when people would come in from the countryside for the week of high holidays and park their car a few blocks away so they could have the ritual of walking to shul, right? That these are important things about sort of sustaining traditions, even when it's sort of impossible to do them in a very rigid way. So that was a beautiful part of the experience, and created a different sense of my knowledge and awareness of the groups that I was studying. So I just want to say how grateful I am for all of those experiences. To your second point, I am very interested in other areas of the hinterlands. Yeah, and when I first began this project, I really spent a lot of time looking at Duluth, which has a very interesting dynamic in terms of waves of refugee resettlement. And so I do see this project certainly as going much broader than Iowa, though really, in a sense, beginning in Iowa, because Iowa not only has the richness of the collections at IWA, but it also has the dynamic of the experience with Scattergood, which was really an outside force that many other Jewish communities in the hinterlands did not have, and gives much more importance to that post-38 wave of German and Austrian refugees, which then impacts how the post-war refugees are addressed. So this is a dynamic. I don't know how exactly I'm defining the hinterlands yet, but I would say Duluth is in and Denver is out, right? I mean, there has to be a certain amount that it has to be a smaller community where the Jewish community is in some ways tenuous and also deeply tied to each other in terms of their success. And I will say one more thing about Iowa that I think is really special on this point, is unlike other areas of the Midwest and West, Iowa had a lot of small, of Jewish businesses where people were broadening out into many, many, many different communities across the state. If you compare this to Nebraska, you have Jewish settlement in really just 4 or 5 different communities. So Iowa has a dynamic that you have Jewish presence in so many different towns throughout Iowa, and you have movement. You have movement from the towns to the cities. So in a sense, it's multiple small communities, but also a single sort of networked small community, which creates really interesting dynamics to look at.
Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to close by thanking Jeanette so much for being here today. It was really fantastic. Thank you.